to another episode of the Spicy Brain podcast. On today's episode, we're going to talk about all things girls with autism, late diagnosed women who might have felt different the majority of their life and didn't really know why. I know for myself, when I got diagnosed, the biggest question I had, surrounded by a little bit of anger and grief, was why did it take so long to get diagnosed? And I know that many women relate to that question. So to solve a lot of the questions we have and a lot of the why is this happening, today we have the most wonderful guest. We have Gina Rippon, who is a neuroscientist. She is the author of The Lost Girls of Autism, which, if you are watching, I'm showing it on camera right now. And ultimately, she is the pioneer of why women like myself have been able to access a diagnosis. Can I call you Gina,
of course you can,
the
yes.
godmother of autism? Is that allowed? Do you accept that? That nickname?
We'll leave that out there for a bit, yeah.
Exactly. But Gina, welcome on to the podcast. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, and I'm delighted to have you on board and having this conversation with us. Can I be honest? I'm a bit starstruck.
Oh.
I felt nervous coming into this conversation because in my journey of learning about autism and my own diagnosis, your work came up again and again and again and again. So I feel like you're my celebrity. You know how people say, what is one celebrity you would have dinner with if you could choose? You would be my guest.
Excellent. See you later.
So there we go. But I, of course, did read your book. And early on in the book, what caught my attention was how you speak about the history of autism, where it started with, I believe it's the father of autism, then to Asperger's over, then to autism spectrum disorder. And today I believe we stand with autism spectrum condition. Could you talk to us a little bit about that timeline and how we got here today?
Yes. Well, you referred to the father of autism, which is, if we were going to pick just one, would probably be Leo Kanner, who was an Austrian psychiatrist working in the States, who wrote a seminal paper in 1944 about 11 children, quite impaired children that he'd been studying. Interestingly, there were 11 children, 8 boys and 3 girls, and that sometimes gets forgotten in the as you will see.
Yeah.
The other father of autism is Hans Asperger, who was writing at the same time. He was in Austria during the Third Reich, another story. And he wrote about 4 boys in particular. He'd been working as a clinician for some time, but his thesis really was about these 4 boys who he felt demonstrated this particular consistent characteristics. And he was the one who spoke about extreme male intelligence and talked about his 4 boys as little professors, etc. So that the whole idea, I mean, the book talks about why it took so long to realize that there were lots of autistic girls and women not being diagnosed. But it was never something that was overtly stated right at the beginning. You know, this is something which is mainly characteristic of boys. I mean, Kanner didn't say that in his 1944 paper. And over time, it became an issue, as I'm sure we'll talk about. So there was this picture of autism emerging. And early on, the focus was very much on the social difficulties, the kind of, I think Kanner coined the term aloof loner type individual who appeared to be completely oblivious to any kind of affective contact around them, didn't respond to affectionate gestures from family members, didn't play with other children, wasn't concerned about other children. So that was his core feature. There was other kind of very unusual aspects of behavior, which we might get onto later. And so that became the kind of defining characteristic. It was about sort of being sort of so self-absorbed they didn't notice what was going on around them and didn't seem to care. You know, they didn't want any kind of affection. And so that was the picture that emerged. And then gradually, as time went on, there was accumulating numbers of cases. There were special tests emerging, about which, again, we'll probably talk later. And if you just looked at the numbers of children initially, and then eventually adults getting diagnosed, there was a preponderance of males. So if you just looked at those stats, it appeared to be a boy problem, and that became the kind of public awareness of autism. So it was something that was nothing right from the beginning. There was no statement, this is characteristic of boys, but it actually accumulated over time and became a very powerful spotlight, as I talk about the idea that, there is a male spotlight problem in the autistic world, not just in research in my area, but also in recognizing children who might be autistic or accepting children for referral, etc. And that was based on this accumulation of numbers without anybody challenging those numbers, saying, why do you think there aren't any women? It was just accepted that they weren't passing whatever tests were being set. And it then came to affect particularly my research area. The geneticist was saying there's some kind of female protective effect, which in a way you think, it's so unusual for female biology to get any kind of positive
absolutely
spin. That, the
it's
idea
usually
might
late and negative.
That's right. So, but anyway, as well, it turned out not to be the case, but it did inform a lot of research, genetic research, and the kind of explanations like the extreme male brain theory of autism, which we might get onto.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what did your journey look like in the research? Because it was a time and moment that you and the team said, wait a second, it might be that 4 to 5 times boys are more likely to be autistic, but what about the women? How did that conversation come about?
Well, it was the basis of where that book came from, because the book before, which was about whether or not that the whole concept of the male brain and the female brain, and I was challenging the research, and conclusion basically was that the whole story of sex differences in the brain has been misinformed, not deliberately diverted, but misinformed. If you look at the research, if you look at the amount of variability in the populations, we cannot say the male brain is like this and the female brain is like this. And there was a certain amount of pushback when that book came out. And I think I mentioned some of the more publishable things I got called, like sex difference denier and feminazi.
Oh, exactly. I was going to ask you, you got called a feminazi. What do you think ruffled so many feathers?
It's very interesting. If you start challenging people's sort of fundamental life beliefs, then probably understandably, they will push back against it. And I think I mentioned that the worthy Daily Telegraph, a reviewer there, said this book this was the gendered brain book. This smacks of feminism with an equality fetish, which I love the idea that, if you're pursuing some kind of interest in equality, that it's a perverse practice. So generally, it was something which people don't like. They have their mind, their worldview. Men are like this, women are like that. And anybody who challenges that must have a different agenda or be misinformed or be a feminazi, for example.
What a word.
Yeah.
Pretty loaded.
But one of the areas that I was quite concerned about, because my kind of day job was really as an autism researcher, but it's kind of very technical brain imaging end to try and see if we could profile the brains of autistic individuals to understand why they experience the world so differently. And the autistic or some autistic community, or perhaps particularly the women's health movement more broadly, said, you shouldn't be denying the existence of sex differences, because there are conditions where there are clear sex differences, and we need research into sex differences to understand where they came from. And if you're talking about women, then one of the brain-based conditions is Alzheimer's. And, so you must understand why it is that more women succumb to Alzheimer's than men, etc. But if you were talking about male brain-based conditions, Parkinson's was the main physical condition.
I read that in the book. It was Parkinson's and autism, which were more predominantly male considered.
So autism was actually, they say, we need, in order to understand why there are more males, autistic males and females, we need to be researching sex differences in the brain. So that was really where the book came from, because they said, you're a neuroscientist, you do research into autism, you shouldn't be denying the existence of sex differences. Write a book, kind of thing. It wasn't quite like that. But anyway, so that's when I then turned to, let's have a look, because I wasn't in a way, I think I start the book with, have been part of the problem that I hope this book will address, because I wasn't looking at sex differences in autism. We were looking at the people we were recruiting, she says defensively, to our research studies in order to get a view of what the autistic brain looked like and whether or not we could profile it as in some way different from the neurotypical brain. And every now and then you'd think, we really don't see many females. But we were reliant on the clinical community for passing on clients for our study.
Data samples, people, right?
So we were the end product of what I call the leaky pipeline, and we weren't getting many autistic women because they weren't being diagnosed.
Yeah.
I mean, and it was to try and resolve that conundrum, partly defensively perhaps, which then revealed the other issues I talk about the recognition, the difficulty of even getting referred for a diagnosis, the fact that the whole diagnostic dice are stacked against females, etc., which meant that, us at the end of that pipeline, there were very few females. And you mentioned 4-1, which is a kind of standard clinical statement, which is still being made to this day. Whereas I think if you look at the research populations, it was much higher. So we're looking, in some cases, 9 or 10-1.
Wow.
Many boys.
And do you think, Gina, because obviously, with awareness and understanding, there's so many more autistic women being diagnosed and granted that validation. But do you think still there's a belief that it's more of a male condition than a female condition?
Yes. I mean, the reason I'm hesitating slightly is because having written about, you shouldn't say the male this or the female this. I'm a bit anxious not to just talk about female autism. But it is the case that there's a large group of individuals, most of whom are female, who have been undiagnosed and who now we are studying them. It's clear that the presentation of their autism is different. So, I mean, I wouldn't like to I call it the chameleon types because they're the ones who mask and hide, etc. So I wouldn't like to call it female, but it's clear that there is a difference. And I think that's one of the good things that's happening for understanding the autistic brain. But there is a kind of slight downside because at the moment there is this whole debate about overdiagnosis. And one of the accusations being made is that that's because there's lots of women are now being made aware that they might be autistic and so they're being diagnosed, and that's contributing to this, in quotes, overdiagnosis debate.
Yeah, and I think it's the motion of people, again, probably the time in which you and the team were called feminazis for trying to bring awareness of a potential difference. I think because we're experiencing such exponential awareness, and it's a compound effect. People speak about it online. We're doing podcasts like this speaking about women that are autistic. And then that reaches more and more and more people. It doesn't mean they're being brainwashed into believing they're autistic. It just means that it might answer some of those fundamental questions they've had their whole life and they felt different, right?
Well, if their whole life they've been told, or their parents have been told when they're concerned parents or carers have taken them to a clinician, that they aren't autistic. So that's your mindset. You think, oh, there's something wrong with me. I can't hold on to relationships, or the relationships I have are toxic. I can't survive the workplace. I have burnouts and all of the kind of difficulties that people report. But you've been told it can't be autism. So you think, well, it can't be autism because that's what you've been told by the experts.
Yeah, and I think a lot of women as well, I'll include myself in that, a lot of autistic women post-diagnosis, because we've survived, shall we say, most of our life without a diagnosis, there's a bit of gaslighting behavior to ourselves as to we're not as autistic or we don't struggle as much. And I think it's that coming to terms with the fact that you are autistic, full stop. It's just you're learning to unmask and to understand that your real challenges were portrayed as you're being the difficult person because you didn't have the answers to your condition. So I think it's a motion of like that healing process post-diagnosis, which is a full cycle of anger, grief, all these things, validation, to then understand that regardless if you've received a diagnosis when you're 10 or when you're 72, which we're going to get onto now, you are autistic, full stop.
Yes. Well, I think there's two parts of the story. First of all, there's the awareness, which I think that's the phase we're in about, and have been for a long time. I mean, there's reference to the, quote, 787% increase in autism diagnosis, at which point we go down the autism epidemic or Tylenol route, if we like.
Gina, don't get me going.
Might need to edit
subject.
that out. Anyway.
No, please don't. No, we actually need to do an episode on that, but that's for another day.
No. So there is the awareness, and I think the awareness was the key thing for why there have been more diagnoses. Acceptance is another issue, and I think that's where we are at the moment and where it's challenging. And that can be not only acceptance from the outside world, particularly from the clinical or the diagnostic world, and the world of people providing therapeutic support or interventions or whatever, but also from, as you said, yourself, so that you've got to accept that this is, got sounds kind of hard, but you are autistic. This is what being autistic is like. Hopefully, people like me will be able to say, this is why you might be autistic. And another stage might be, this is why women behave in this particular way, which gets us back to gender, etc. And so I think you're right. It's if you all your life you've been blamed for being difficult and struggling, then it's hard not to accept it, because you also have the kind of sneery tones of, the much vaunted victim status. So, you're
the labels.
You're just saying you can't do that because you're autistic, not quite get a grip. Yeah, probably get a grip sometimes, whatever.
Yeah.
And, you're just using it as an excuse, which is a really nasty route to go down.
Yeah, and I think that comes from uneducation, but uneducation of people that don't want to learn and don't want to be part of the solution of supporting more women. Because when I started sharing my story online for other women to maybe see, as a relatable experience, some of the comments, now overwhelming positive comments, but obviously you always think of some of the negatives. Autistic mothers of autistic children that might be more on the profoundly autistic side, saying that we're taking resources away from kids that really need it, all the way to men saying that if you've survived all your life without a diagnosis, you're not autistic, you're just lazy, get up off the sofa and stop making excuses for yourself. I'm like, I wish.
Yes.
I wish that was my case. But unfortunately, to you and to many others, you'd hate to hear that there's so many other women like me. I am not unique or special in that case. And that actually leads me on, Gina, to, in the book, I was fascinated. And when telling my family and friends that you were coming on to the podcast, I kept referencing back to this woman, because part of the research pool that you had of autistic women, you had age range from young girls all the way to adult women that have been late diagnosed autistic. And the eldest lady you had was 72, newly diagnosed.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think that's, it was unusual for my story, but it's not that unusual. And quite a lot of the time now, interestingly, I've had a huge amount of correspondence since the book came out from women who are saying, I read your book. I'm 85. I had one the other day. Read your book. And
so
do you think
wonderful.
it's worth me getting a diagnosis? And we'll describe a bit of the difficulties they've had. And, to some extent, I could say, well, if you've, there are enough resources out there, and sometimes this is a criticism, for you to self-diagnose if there's a clear enough picture. And I think there is a better picture emerging. If you fit that picture, then, embrace that feeling, that term for yourself, if you think it's helpful. And I think getting an assessment gives it some kind of validation if you want. I will also say that, I don't know what your resources are, but the waiting lists in the UK are 5 years and rising for an assessment. So, if it's important that you get an official label, then yes, absolutely. But I think that you did mention briefly the idea that seeking an assessment, particularly if you're an adult, because a lot of bearing in mind, to go back, autism is a neurodevelopmental condition.
Yes.
Children are born autistic, and the difficulties emerge. And I do say difficulties advisedly, because I know that's another issue. Early on in some children, they are the children who are now what we might call profoundly impaired, and there is a move to have the term profound autism developed, and perhaps only applied to traditional autism. So those children will have been identified very early on, be clear that they've got difficulties, schools will have been alerted, they will have therapy, etc. I don't think, 85-year-old, 72-year-old women or whatever will be diverting resources from that population. The people who are dealing with those children are not the people who are dealing with the waiting lists. And I think that's important. It could be an issue in educational support, and there is a whole kind of separate political, governmental debate about special educational needs. But again, I don't think somebody feeling that it would be important to find out if they're autistic is going to be diverting many resources. I don't know if anybody's actually looked at that. It's a very firm, very often repeated statement.
It is.
I keep saying, well, how do you know that?
Yeah, I know. I think it's an assumption they've created because they fear that the growth of maybe diagnosis in adult women is taking away from their children that are in need, and no one's denying that. It's a different experience, not less, not more. It's a different daily set of challenges. But I, as I mentioned, I definitely have received that. And when I got diagnosed, I was still coming to terms of like what autism was and how could I speak about it and communicate my challenges. And the common question was, if you've survived childhood, what's the point of getting a diagnosis at this stage? So people ask that for me, but they ask it also for that 75-year-old woman and the 82-year-old
who
woman
was a very
as well.
successful scientist.
Exactly. So what do you think is the benefits of someone like them getting diagnosed? Because for me, I can say it was life-changing. Not the diagnosis, but accommodating my needs to have better quality of daily life and not to be in constant meltdown, shutdown, burnout. I understand myself now, and that's what's changed my life. So
in a way, you could say that should be the goal of all forms of therapy, really. That's somebody has issues of any kind and they seek help, and that's the kind of number one goal you would hope. And that may make that person's life better, result, or it may turn out that they need some support, and then you can identify what support they need. So there is that. It's the issue, and it's said in both ways. If you've been as successful as you are, you can't be autistic, or you don't look autistic, or you're not autistic enough. And I think that completely sets aside the clear evidence that the success has come at a huge cost, that the success has been because these people have struggled all their lives, have repressed, masked the difficulties they have made the wrong decisions in order that nobody should find out that they've got these kind of difficulties, all of that. So you're setting that aside and saying, oh, look, how successful you are. And then, people might say, you have no idea. But these will also be people who've had all sorts of different mental health conditions or physical conditions, because if you're living in a state of constant stress, constant exhaustion, then it has physical consequences as well. And setting that aside and saying, so why do you need to know if you're autistic? You could say, well, how long have you got? But as your phrase, I understand myself. I think that's, that should be the key goal of all of these kind of discussions.
100%. And I think, have you ever heard of the term the lost generation of
Yes.
autism? Because obviously, with the growth of diagnosis in autism, there's this concept that, yes, it is a genetic condition, people say. And I say that people say because I'm not educated on the matter, I'm just repeating what I read. But there is this concept that I am 31 and the generation above don't have a diagnosis and they never will get one because what's the point? So I find it quite heartwarming that these ladies later on in life still pursue answers to some of the challenges they've had in their lifetime. And I think there is no such thing as a lost generation if that generation is still with us. It's never too late to pursue a diagnosis.
That's absolutely crucial. And there's some really stunning statistics coming out about autism in old age, now. And a lot of the difficulties in geriatric wards and in care homes and things could well be explained by and they can be male as well as female, because sometimes males, will present in the same way as females, and they will have managed to be successful. I mean, there is this picture of this hugely successful, and again, I use the term advisedly, white male nerd, who is the stereotypical autistic individual. So they can be very successful people, but, perhaps not at that end of the spectrum. We might get onto that. There are people who have been difficult all their lives, and they're difficult in their care home, or their, the support that has emerged as they get older, and that could well be because they are undiagnosed autistic. And the lost generation, I think there was a group of psychologists once it started emerging about how biased the diagnostic system had been, because people did start putting their hands up and saying, this could be right. So there was a paper by, I think Simon Baron-Cohen was an author on it, about the lost generation, saying, of course, that means that, that we've got this kind of maybe it's the right term, tsunami of people who haven't received a diagnosis, who are now part of our much older generation, who actually the difficulties they have could well be explained by wondering if they are actually autistic.
Yeah, and what do you think is the cost of undiagnosed autism at the age of, say, of like 50, 60, 70, 80?
Well, just in terms of, I'm going to divide this into two bits. For example, there's a big issue, awareness now emerging about the consequences of the menopause on the emergence of autistic symptoms, or almost as though, you've been very, very close to the threshold, and then there's this amazing hormonal event and it pushes you over the threshold, and there's all sorts of problems at that age. So that could be part of it. But I think that the whole issue of who is or who isn't autistic is it's a consequence of the bias system that we've been looking at. In fact, I was thinking when you said it, I was going to take it back a bit, because I always get very annoyed about arguments about spending money on children with special educational needs, whatever they may be. My answer is just look at the cost of children who aren't identified. Look at the prisons. Look at the women who have suffered domestic abuse. Look at crime statistics, etc. So, I think that's a cost, not diagnosing early on. But I think for the older ones, they will have had a history of, characteristically a history of domestic abuse, because their difficulty with understanding social relationships makes them vulnerable to domestic abuse, etc. Unsuccessful relationships, drop out of university more often, struggle in the workplace, and then get into all sorts of financial difficulties. So there is a cost of, even if it is being greater self-esteem, of understanding why you're having difficulties. And you mentioned accommodation, and I think that's really important, because I think again we come back to awareness and acceptance. Sometimes the accommodation that autistic people need in schools, for example, or in the workplace are actually quite minor. They're not huge.
And
huge.
they're free.
They can be free.
For
they can
whoever's providing not all. I'm not saying all accommodations are free, but some are.
Yes, and they can be terribly helpful to the whole workplace.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just, for autistic people have to be. But even understanding that, if there's a big push in the company that we should all, work as teams and get on together.
Do you know what my issue was, Gina, within the workplace? At one stage, I had a background in tech, so I was in technology sales, and any startup loves an open plan office. I would go into utter shutdown when I had to call a client, and all I thought in my mind was I was more focused on what everyone was listening and hearing versus doing my job on the phone.
Yes.
So I would take myself away to a little room to have a private space so I could do my work properly. And that was demonized. That was
You're not a team player.
I'm not a team player. I wasn't confident enough to have a call on the open floor and so many other things. And that came at the cost of nothing, in the sense that would have been free as an accommodation to let me go into that space. Safe to say I didn't last too long in that job based on
what loss there lost, you see. What a cost. It's a cost.
I moved on to another tech startup that was accommodating in the things that I was requesting. But I also think accommodations, when you're autistic, it's hard to know what accommodations are at your disposal, and I think it's a collaboration with the workplace and the individual as to what can we provide, and therefore what would be helpful for you. Because usually we're asked, what can I do for you? I don't know. I don't even know what autism is, and I've just been diagnosed in some occasions.
Well, I think that's part of the awareness and education as well. I mean, it should not just be down to schools, clinicians, whatever. It should be whoever, I guess it'd be HR or something, who would say, and we probably should get onto strengths as well at some point. Addressing the autistic strengths an individual can bring to the workplace will bring with it a certain cost in terms of what adaptations there need to be, and that should be part of an understand. The workplace, the culture of the workplace. So not down to the individual to ask or to be singled out in a particular way, that everybody should have an autism-friendly culture, because there are a lot of autistic people. We're talking in some cases about 1 in 30 individuals. So that's a lot of people who could bring a lot of strengths to the workplace.
100%. And I think a lot of the corporate environments and workplaces are heavily based on social relationships, which completely neglects the fact of what is the job at hand? What is the task that individual needs to carry out without the socializing? And I think if we focused on that, so many autistic people would thrive, and they would find a job that they would eat up and spit out 5 times better than your neurotypical colleague. So I think it's looking at that and the task versus the socializing and how well can someone integrate and be a team player, that I think then more autistic people would be employed.
Well, in fact, that's again something that people are writing about. Looking at the unemployment rate or underemployment rate is really important. But I think it's interesting because a lot of the current arguments about working from home and the big businesses saying, we need social cohesion, the water cooler conversations kind of thing, which completely ignores the fact that, the social cohesion and the water cooler conversations can be anathema to some people who still do their jobs very well and will improve the firm's productivity, but really do not want to go off to the pub after work.
Well, most business, I find in some industries, and the most social relationships to get promoted and all the rest happens at the pub, which is outside of the office, over drink, which we do know that the correlation of alcohol with people that are autistic or ADHD, and that correlation, might not be the best.
Yes, that's right.
And I've experienced that, and I'm sure many other autistic people have as well.
But I think just, workplace understanding, you'd hope they're mostly interested in the bottom line. And as you said, a lot of the adjustments are fairly minor, and they could be accommodated, and you'd get a much greater productivity and probably a much happier
Absolutely.
workplace.
Sorry, I just go, you start talking about work and corporate life, and I'm like, here's my opinion, my 2 cents. But we were speaking about kind of the lost generation of people that might be misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. But I also read in your book the fact that autistic girls on average wait 2 years longer than autistic boys in accessing a diagnosis, even after concerns have been raised. In my understanding, autism awareness is growing. So why are little girls still waiting longer than boys to access?
Great question. Well, two things. First of all, very often, the fact you talk about autistic girls or autistic girls waiting, there's actually quite a long list before, a long time before girls will actually get referred.
Yes.
I talk about that study where teachers were given identical vignettes, stories about misbehaving children and anonymous stories, and they were said, they were then told, the child's name is, and the teachers who were told the child's name is Jack, they would be much more likely to say, yes, that child is autistic and needs help. Whereas if they were told the child exactly the same story is called Chloe, then they're much less likely to refer them. So there's that barrier that has to be overcome. But even if somebody thinks, oh yes, maybe an autism referral, girls have to wait longer because we are in the world of 5-year waiting lists. Which, bearing in mind, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. If you think of somebody who at the age of 12 or something gets referred, if they have to wait till they're 17 before they're assessed, it's too late. It's too late by then anyway, but they will get no support through their school years.
And they are such crucial years.
Absolutely.
Such crucial years. And, I know we're speaking about autistic women and autistic girls, but it's, as you mentioned, it's people that are camouflaging and fall into that group of autism. And I think something I share with a lot of late diagnosed autistic women is that journey of misdiagnosis before you reach the autism diagnosis. In my case, it was generalized anxiety and depression. Many other women report eating disorders, bipolar, IBS, all these different things. So
borderline personality disorder, that's very popular.
Yes.
One of the women I spoke to was talking about diagnosis bingo. They used to compare, have you been told you're borderline personality disorder? Tick.
Yeah.
Are you OCD? A tick, whatever. And they've had all of them, and an alphabet soup, another person referred to.
Yeah.
And yes, so that tells the story in itself. But I think the 2 years, so that's part of it. But it's also the case that if girls get as far as, looking at girls who get as far as being diagnosed or being referred for a diagnosis, boys are 10 times. I keep thinking, I read that several times, 10 times more likely to be diagnosed as autistic than girls. Then you think, why did nobody think, I wonder if we're missing something here? Which, of course, is then when they got into these so-called gold standard tests, which on the surface, and they are supposedly the peak of, this is not just a self-diagnosis checklist or a symptom checklist of some kind. These are the tests which, if you're in the States and you need insurance, the children have to have had these assessment. Similarly, in this country, if you want a child needs a care plan, EHCP, if they exist when this podcast goes out, who knows, then they need a formal diagnosis.
Okay.
Immensely costly, terribly time consuming. I think the interview schedule, the Autism Diagnosis ADI, as it's called, interview schedule, something like 93 questions. So these are the parents or carers of children being referred, or adults themselves have to answer the questions. So they're hugely complex. You have to wait a long time, and they look on the surface amazingly valid and reliable because there's a whole set of different sorts of questions. Clinicians are trained to follow rigidly the script. And there's a scoring system and there's algorithms which work out eventually whether you are or you aren't autistic. But of course, all of this is based on behavior and somebody's interpretation of that behavior. And of course, when they were developing these tests, they were testing them on individuals who'd already been diagnosed, who were mainly male. So nobody thought, I wonder if there's anything in these systems which are meaning the girls who get that far, which is difficult in itself, are failing these tests because they're actually set up to identify boys or girls who behave like boys. And I think that's quite important too, because there always were females identified, much fewer of them. But that was because they fitted the template, the male template, which is all there was. There was never any separate assessment for this is a girl, therefore we should be asking these kind of questions. Yeah. So that was the issue. So, and those are still compulsory at the moment. It's still the case that for funding, autism funding, when you're presenting your business case, you have to guarantee that the individuals you're looking at are genuinely autistic because they've had these gold standard tests.
Yeah, and it does feel like with all the misdiagnosis of women, it's as if they are misdiagnosing with conditions that could seem treatable, instead of focusing on the core condition, which is that person might have generalized anxiety and might have depression because they are masking their autism and they're really struggling. And that is a byproduct of the condition of autism. So do you think that it's maybe that bias that's leading them to diagnose with conditions that could be treated?
Yeah, well, there's two things. I think the camouflaging and masking are obviously core of this whole discussion, really. And in a weird kind of not quite self-fulfilling prophecy, because the camouflaging was so successful, then they weren't spotted. And there is an interesting tone sometimes to say, clinicians can get a bit defensive to say, oh, well, we didn't diagnose the women because they were hiding, they were masking, etc. In plain sight. And that wasn't something they were primed to ask about or to spot, which has changed now. It is getting better. So that was part of it, and I think that's a core issue in terms of understanding why they were missed for so long. And I think an even more important question, which kind of emerged at the end of the book, was why is it more characteristic of women that they should try and mask?